Hello, everyone. Welcome, my supply chain and logistics friends. I am Professor Rodriguez, your college instructor, supply chain executive, and co-founder of the MVC Logistics Academy. If you're familiar with the channel or you happen to fall upon it, then you know that I bring you supply chain education that is easy to digest and career development advice that's easy to implement. If you want to catch up on the rest of the Learning Logistics series, I'm going to link them in the description or somewhere here in the cards so you can catch up on lessons 1 through 3. Now, in today's lesson, we're going to talk about lesson number 4, and that is what are process cycles in the supply chain. So what do you say? Let's get right to it and let's learn some logistics and supply chain. Okay, so let's talk about what are the process cycles in a supply chain. Now, just to recap, in lesson number 1, we learned what is supply chain and we talked about supply chain flows. In lesson number 2, we talked about the objective of the supply chain, where we discussed supply chain surplus and customer value. In lesson number 3, we talked about the importance of supply chain decisions and how they're made based on a particular time frame. Here in lesson number 4, we will talk about what comes next, and that is process cycles. So we have established by now that a supply chain is a network or a matrix. And it's really where companies come together or work towards the same goal, and that goal is to fulfill customer demand. Now, a supply chain is also considered as a flow of material, information, and finances as it moves in all directions with all these different members in our supply chain. Now we will talk about the processes that happen in the supply chain. And in this sense, we can also think of the supply chain as a sequence of processes and flows that take place within and between different stages and come together to fill a customer need for a particular product. There are 2 ways to view the processes that are performed in a supply chain, and that's as a cycle view and as a push and pull view. And you know me, I'm going to talk about them in detail in the upcoming slides. So let's take a look at that. First up, we have cycle views. The cycle view really is the processes in a supply chain that are divided into a series of cycles, each performed at the interface between 2 successive stages of a supply chain. Now, this concept is used to represent a sequence of 4 stages that go from supplier to the final customer. And as you guessed it, I'm going to talk about those in detail next. Now, keep in mind that each of these stages will also have its own individual cycles or subcycles or sub-processes, as they're known, which is a sequence of operations and transactions that are taking place between 2 stages. So here, as I mentioned before, each cycle occurs at the intersection between 2 successive stages of the supply chain. Let's begin this one by looking at customer order cycle. And as you can see here, this is the first cycle and it's taking place between the customer and the retailer stage. Now, a customer order cycle takes place when orders are placed, prepared, and shipped. For traditional retail settings or retail stores, the customer is often picking orders from store's inventory, or think of shelves, which represents the point of final demand. For online retailers, on the other hand, well, this is when a customer actually places an order online. Customer order cycles are particularly important since they are the driver of further cycles upstream of the supply chain. Now, you've heard me say it before. I know you're going to get tired of me saying it over and over again, but customers are the driving force behind supply chains. They're the driver of the supply chain. And this makes a lot of sense here when we talk about customer order cycles and the importance that they have as we continue to flow into different cycles in our supply chain. So next we have replenishment cycle. the replenishment cycle functions around the steps involved to resupply outlets or retailers from distribution centers and wholesalers. Each retailer places orders to distributors based on its own fluctuation of demand. It really involves inventory that has already been manufactured and stored in different locations in parts of the supply chain. So, once again, replenishment cycle. Well, it's in the name, so that's sort of a giveaway. Replenishment means to restock or bring the numbers back up to a certain level of our stock. So that's between what the retailer decides will have as a particular demand and what they place an order with the distributors to actually get enough stock to fulfill that demand. Here we have the manufacturing cycle. Now, the manufacturing cycle concerns the scheduling of production in light of demand from distributors. This is when we know what it is that we're going to have as far as demand from our distributor and what we should be focusing on manufacturing based on those orders that were placed. Up next, we have the procurement cycle. Now, the procurement cycle involves the scheduling of the components required in the manufacturing of a good. Now, keep in mind that not every supply chain will have all 4 cycles clearly separated or in use. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. Say, for example, a retailer like Walmart, their supply chain, in which the retailer stocks the finished goods inventory and places replenishment orders with the distributor, is likely to have all 4 different cycles very separated. In contrast, a company, say like Dell or Apple, they can bypass the retailer and the distributor when it sells directly to customers through their own channels. So in some cases, there's a retailer, a distributor involved before it reaches the customer. And in other cases, we might have a manufacturer, such as Dell or Apple, that they sell directly to the customer, bypassing a distributor or a retailer in some cases. Okay, so keep that in mind. If you recall that I mentioned earlier, each cycle consists of 6 sub-processes as well. So we're going to take a look at that next. Now, each cycle starts with the supplier marketing the products to customers. A buyer then places an order that is then received by the supplier. The supplier fulfills the order, which is received by the buyer. The buyer receives the order. And in some cases, the buyer may return some of the product or recycle some of the material back to the supplier or through a third party. Then the cycle of activities begins all over again. So think of these 6 different sub-processes as sort of individual little things that happen within each of the different cycles or each of the different customer order cycle, replenishment cycle, manufacturing cycle, procurement cycle. All of these sort of have to happen simultaneously as sub-processes. We also have to consider that depending on the transaction in question, the sub-process mentioned before can be applied to the appropriate cycle. Even though each cycle has the same basic sub-processes, there are a few important differences among the cycles. First difference is that in the customer order cycle, demand is external to the supply chain and uncertain. In all other cycles, demand is also uncertain, but can be projected based on certain actions at each supply chain stage. For example, in the procurement cycle, a tire supplier to an automobile manufacturer can predict the demand precisely once the production schedule at the manufacturer is known. The second difference across cycles relates to the scale of an order. Whereas a customer buys a single car, if we're taking it back to the automobile manufacturer example, one customer buys a single car. A dealership orders multiple cars at a time from the manufacturer. And the manufacturer, in turn, has to order an even larger quantity of tires from the supplier. As we move from the customer to the supplier, the number of individual orders declines and the size of each order increases. Thus, sharing of information and operating policies across the different supply chain stages really becomes more important as we move further from the end customer. So, why is a cycle view so important within the concepts of supply chain? Well, a cycle view of a supply chain clearly defines the processes involved and the owners of each process. This view is useful when considering operational decisions because, one, it specifies the roles and responsibilities of each member of the supply chain, and is also going to give us what will be the desired outcome of each process. So that's why it's so important to know, because it clearly defines what are the processes, who will be doing these processes, and what do we want to achieve out of these processes. So who does them, what's going to happen, and what's the end result. So if you know me, you know that I like some examples. So here we're going to look at the example number 1, and that's Amazon. Now, in this example, I'm going to explain how the process view changes based on the perspective that you're looking into the supply chain. So in this example, we're going to think of Amazon, and we're going to think from the side of the customer who shops at Amazon. So that could be you. I'm sure you have at some point in time bought something from Amazon. I know I do. I'm guilty of it. So think of it in that perspective. When a customer shops Amazon, they become part of the customer order cycle. With the customer, you and me, being the buyer, and Amazon being the supplier. Meaning that when we go online or when we go in the app for Amazon and we place an order with Amazon, we, the customer, you and me, we are the buyer in this situation. Amazon, because they're supplying the products that we need, or maybe that we don't need and buy them anyway, they supply those products to you and to me, which are the customer. In this cycle, we're considered the customer order cycle. Now, in contrast, when Amazon orders, for example, say books, or they order the latest gadget that's the hype online, when they order something from a distributor to replenish its inventory, they're being part of the replenishment cycle. Amazon is now the buyer, and the distributor will be the supplier. So you see how it changes depending on how we look and what is the perspective we have in the supply chain. Before, when we were buying products from Amazon as a consumer and a customer, we were the buyer. That's at that particular point, and we were considered part of the customer order cycle. If we move a stage and Amazon now has to buy more product to put on their site, they become the buyer. And whoever is selling that product to Amazon becomes the supplier. Up next, we're going to talk about how the buyer and the supplier play a role in the cycles and their responsibilities. When we talk about responsibilities, we really mean the ultimate goal or objectives for either the supplier and the buyer. Within each cycle, the goal of to ensure product availability and to achieve economies of scale in ordering. Now, if you think about what is economies of scale, or if this is a new term to you, well, this is commonly used in production or manufacturing processes that refers to proportionate savings in cost that is gained by increased levels of production. When we talk about it from the sense of a buyer, it says that the goal of the buyer is to ensure product availability and also to achieve economies of scale in ordering, meaning that if we're able to order more, we might be able to get a cheaper cost per unit so that we're able to pay less for the products that we have to purchase as a buyer. Next, we see that the supplier looks to forecast customer orders and reduce the cost of receiving order. The buyer then works to reduce the cost of the receiving process internally The supplier then works to fill the orders that are made on time and to improve efficiency and accuracy of the order fulfillment process. Great. So this brings us now to the push and pull view. So we're going to talk about that next. All processes in a supply chain fall into one or two categories, depending on the timing of their execution relative to the end customer demand. We have two. We have pull and we have push processes. With pull processes, execution is initiated in response to a customer order. On the flip side, the push processes, this execution is initiated in anticipation of customer orders based on a forecast. So again, we have pull and push. Pull, we're basically initiating a response to a customer order, meaning the customer is pulling the product, pulling the order from us in that sense. The push process would be that we think there will be this much demand. We're going to push product out and hopefully meet that demand as we sell the products. So pull processes may also be referred to as reactive processes because they react to customer. A push-pull view of the supply chain categorizes processes based on whether they are initiated in response to a customer order or a pull, or in anticipation of a customer order, a push. This view is useful when considering strategic decisions that relate to the supply chain design. Meaning that if we're looking to do the structure of what our processes will look like when we're designing our supply chains, then we do them based whether we're going to be pushing product out to the customer or we're going to wait for the customer to pull orders out from our products. So here we're going to look at example number 2, Home Depot. And this is going to be your second and final example for this lesson. In this in particular, we're going to look at what it for one retailer and for one industry, what the push-pull boundaries might look like. So the paint industry provides another example of the pull-push boundary. With Home Depot in particular, if you think back in the 80s, Home Depot had to procure paint based on forecasts of the colors that would be in demand for a particular time period. Because of this, paint manufacturers required production of the base, then mixing of the suitable colors for the order, and finally the packing. All these processes were performed in large factories, and paint cans were shipped to Home Depot and the stores for final purchase. This form of product placement qualified as push processes because they were performed based on a forecast in anticipation of the actual customer demand. Given the uncertainty of demand in general, Home Depot's paint supply chain had great difficulty matching the supply that they had based on what they expected the colors were going to be popular or in demand that particular period and what the actual demand was like. We fast forward to the 90s, and Home Depot's paint supply chain was restructured such that the mixing of the colors was actually done at the retail stores after customers placed their orders. In other words, color mixing was shifting from a push to the pull phase of the supply chain. The paint-based preparation and the packing of the cans was still performed in the push phase. And the result was that the customer is always able to get the color of their choice, while the total paint inventories across their supply chain really declined. And that brings us to the end of lesson number 4. In the next lesson that we have in our Learning Logistics series, we're going to discuss what are supply chain macro processes. So this is sort of in progression of this today's lesson and into what we're going to talk about next. As always, I want to thank you for watching. I'm Professor Rodriguez, your supply chain and logistics YouTube bestie, teaching you everything you need to know to take your career to the next level. Thank you so much for watching. See you soon.